Hi, everyone, and welcome to Kirby Sommers' True Crime Podcast. Today is November 25th. It is the day after Thanksgiving, which is typically celebrated in the United States. I hope those of you who did Turkey Day had a nice time. Today, I wanted to bring you up to date on some sort of misinformation that I've been hearing that really should be straightened out about certain things with the Kennedy family and with Robert Maxwell. And also, I wanted to give you sort of like a preview of what I will be exposing in the upcoming Epstein Project newsletter, which drops on Tuesday. And all of which is going to be shocking to you because I'm really going to do a major dive into drumroll, Eva Anderson, before she was Eva Anderson Dubin. And you're not going to believe, uh, you know what? I'm going to save it until I say like the video. Like the video, please like the video and subscribe. Where to start? Well, first, listen, what I want to do is I certainly want to thank you guys for the words of encouragement. I've received so many emails from everyone who's aware that, my Twitter was removed from me about a week ago already, I think. But you know what? One door closes, 10 more open, and that's how I feel about it. So to remind those of you who might be new to my channel, I was a sex slave to one of the elites in this world that Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell lived in. He's several, I would say he's above them by several notches. He and his family have been part of this world, I would say, since 1947, 1945, although the work and the story and the underpinning of this trafficking, multiple rings, did not begin in 1945 as other people appear to be claiming. It began before that. But for our purposes, at least for today, I just want to say that, I was a victim. I was turned into someone I didn't want to be for a number of 8 years. It gave me inside information, not information that somebody would read, let's say, for example, in mainstream media, which, as you know, is an arm of the intelligence, but information that I obtained firsthand, either through experience or because of the person that I would have to travel with. So, for example, I would have to travel to Washington, D.C., where I saw the connections between my abuser and, let's say, for example, Joe Biden or Donald Trump, or a generation before when his father was requested by Kennedy Sr., so that would be John F. Kennedy's father, to bring his Zionist friends to the Hotel Pierre in New York City, where a meeting was arranged before Kennedy was elected, when Kennedy was still accepting money for the presidential campaign. And Kennedy's father, who, by the way, was a bootlegger, all right, he was a criminal, just like the rest of these people. So I don't know why people somehow put the Kennedy family on a certain plateau as if they weren't a criminal family. If you want to like them, fine. Me, I don't trust any politician because I know too much. I've seen too much. So, some are better than others, I'm sure. but everyone is connected to the same cabal, and that cabal happens to be the elites. So you do not become a multimillionaire or a billionaire if you're not part of the same group. But in any event, on the request of the bootlegger, who also went into Hollywood, and he started buying up motion picture companies, and he began RKO, which was a portion of which was purchased by my abuser's father, Mishillam Rickless. So he owned a piece of RKO, and that's how he got his teenage bride, Pia Zadora, into movies many years later. And this is the movie industry, the film industry, if you don't know this by now, it's an arm of the intelligence. All right. And we get to see what they want us to see. So just to be clear, I lived in this world. I'm not Googling my facts. I get them from experience. And yeah, I've been searching for answers as to why there have been attempts on my life, because I've been battling this monster for decades, much longer than I think anyone who has written about the Epstein story can ever lay claim to. Okay, so in the last podcast, which I did 2 days ago, I discussed K Griggs, who spent about 7.5 hours talking to her pastor, Rick Strawcutter. She is look, I know some of you left positive sounding comments on the video on my podcast of 2 days ago, saying, well, maybe K Griggs is in a nursing home. She's 80 years old. She could be alive. Why do you do this? The woman is dead. She was probably murdered, just like the first wife of the guy that she was married to, who was a Marine colonel by the name of George Griggs, and a personal friend of White House correspondent Sarah McClendon. Now, wishful thinking doesn't change facts. And I understand that this is a dark subject, and a lot of people have been murdered. I mean, I think 99.9% of anyone listening to this podcast will know, for example, that Danny Casolaro was murdered and not suicided, right? So why not just accept that K Griggs went on this show 7.5 hours, exposing as much as she was able to expose, because she was afraid for her life. She basically said it, I am afraid for my life. So why don't you just, it upsets me, because I tend to have to repeat myself many times over sometimes, and I still get pushback. And I don't know if it's intentional. I don't know if it's the hired little voices that are supposed to just say, no, K Griggs is alive and well, and what she exposed was not really the truth, and she was a conspiracy theorist, and she was a fantasist. I don't know if it comes from that, but know that the internet is full of fake accounts like that, and they troll videos like mine. They troll books like the ones I have written. They troll Twitter. They're everywhere. There are more of them than there are of us. And us means those of us who want to expose the elite's multiple crimes, which have an element of child trafficking, but include so much more. So in any event, I want to just get back to something that K Griggs shared in this interview that I forgot to share 2 days ago. So she walked into the White House, and at the time, the president was Bill Clinton. You're no stranger to Clinton, who is a big part of the Jeffrey Epstein story, but actually he's a big part of the story throughout, because we do have Clinton as the governor in Arkansas during the MENA time, when the planes would land to be tweaked. They had to change the way they were configured, where a part was built on these planes to make it easier to drop drugs and guns. Okay, so he was in Mena, Arkansas as the governor. He's been part of the story for a very, very long time, and even his days at Oxford. All right, so, and his connection with Hillary Rodham in Arkansas, it was sort of a marriage of convenience. In fact, Clinton has gone on the record to say, very long time ago, and I'm sure it's probably no longer there, that they had their daughter, Chelsea, just to sort of present to the world. And that's the thing, the duplicity, to present to the world that they were, like, quote, a regular family. So they had a daughter for appearance's sake. I'm sure that when you decide with your spouse or your significant other to either adopt a child or have a child, you're not doing it just for appearance sake. It's not like buying a purse or buying a new car. You're doing it because you want to have a family. Well, that was not the reason that they did it. In any event, Bill Clinton was the president during the time that K Griggs walked into the State Department, she said, and her husband had an office there. But what I forgot to tell you is that Ghislaine Maxwell's nephew, Alexander, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing this properly, DJERASSI, so Alexander DeRossi. I should have looked that up before I started this podcast, but in any event, he worked for 3 years in the State Department during Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's tenure there. And he was actually put in charge of the, I have it here, but he was put in charge of, let's see. Yeah, he was put in charge of the Department of State's Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs, covering the relations between the United States and Arab states, including, of course, Israel and Iran from 2009 to 2012. Now, Kay Griggs walked in, she walked around, and she said the following. She said every single person there was wearing a yarmulke. A yarmulke, I think I'm pronouncing that right, or yarmulke. It could be a yarmulke and with a silent R. Yarmulke is this tiny skull cap that is worn by very religious Jewish people. You see it at the synagogue. You see it, being worn by the Hasidim community. You see it being worn primarily, when people go to service at their shul, which is, I guess, a Yiddish word for the place of worship. In any event, she said that everybody there was wearing yarmulkes, and that there were pictures everywhere of Israel, and that she questioned that, in fact, she actually tried to talk to what she referred to as the head then, who would have been Isabel Maxwell's son, Dale, right? So, and that he wasn't around, but she wanted to know why the Arabs weren't represented, since it was the Middle Eastern part of the State Department. It's like, so where's the representation for the Arab state? And there was none. And this reminded me of Jeffrey Epstein's office that he had on the East Side, and which I write about in my new book, Epstein's Women, where there's so much, and sometimes I wonder what I should leave in or what I should leave out, because I don't want to talk for 10 hours. But so yes, at Villard House, which is located on 53rd Street on Madison Avenue, in the office that he once shared with Stephen Hoffenberg, who is really the person who knew Bill Clinton, by the way. So I'm sorry to say, Whitney Webb has a lot of information that is incomplete, inaccurate. I started to listen to her interview with Glenn Beck, and I had to stop, because if you're a newbie to the Epstein case, I think that you should get the complete picture. And not only does she omit facts, I don't know if it's just because she doesn't know, or I really I don't know, but she also misconstrues information. So I'm just gonna tweak some of the information, and I really only listened to maybe 10 minutes, because I was just annoyed. I was annoyed because I discovered that she's a multi-millionaire, that her father is one of the wealthiest men anywhere, that she herself has a net worth of close to $10 million, and she's only, as she said on the air, 33 years old. 33 is an occult number. Certainly at the age of 33, she's being propelled upwards by the same elite crowd that she is supposed to be representing. In any event, I'm going to just take a step back and say that when she starts talking to Glenn Beck, she does discuss Robert Maxwell, and she makes a couple of comments that are not correct. And I'm going to just correct that right now. She claims that Robert Maxwell established a presence in New York just a couple of years before he died. And it's sort of like, and then included Glenn in that statement. And I forget how she included her, but obviously Glenn was part of Robert Maxwell's takeover of the New York Daily News just a little bit before he died. And she was given a make-believe job, just like she was given a make-believe job when in the UK, when, you know, under his publishing of newspapers, by the way, so another intelligence position, she had a role to play. So the truth of the matter is that Robert Maxwell has always had a presence in New York City. And that began, if you read my book, Jeffrey Epstein, Predator Spy, and you read my book on Ghislaine Maxwell, An Unauthorized Biography, you will see that Robert Maxwell had a location already in New York as early as 1953. He had a bookstore that was owned by the Joneses of Jones Beach. You know what? I would have to go back to my book, but I know that it was owned by someone. The Joneses of Jones Beach were actual, they would go to this bookstore, as well as the Astors and all of the very wealthy families of New York City. I wrote about that part of his life because the way that he acquired the bookstore in 1953, and I believe it was on East 53rd Street, so 53, maybe numbers mean something, maybe they don't, was because while he was in the Army, for World War II, he began to become connected to publishers who did not have access to being able to get their materials out because of the war. So he worked for British intelligence during the war, and he created sort of like a side business helping these German publishers bringing in paper for them, but he did it in such a way that he said, well, I'm not going to just do this for you for a fee. I want partnership. And so he ended up getting partnership not only with them, but then he created, and I'm not kidding you, he created with Betty Maxwell, his wife, Ghislaine Maxwell's mother, about 100 companies. And then what he did, he would like buy these companies for very little money, right? These companies that were already suffering because of the war. And then he would dismantle them, just like in the 1980s, Michael Milken would do, with the buying of taking over a corporation, selling it off for parts, leaving unemployment and the stockholders in the lurch. So in the early 1950s, Robert Maxwell was doing the same thing. And one of these companies, and when he would loot the companies, obviously what he looted, including the equipment of the companies, by the way, and the assets of the company. And in this case, it was property in New York City, and which I'll get to in a minute because that's where the bookstore was. So he would just keep it. He would create other companies that he and Betty Maxwell owned. So Betty Maxwell was always aware that her husband was a crook because she was part of it. But if you read her memoir and you read anything about Betty Maxwell, she's portrayed as this long-suffering wife, which is she's not. She was part of the whole thing all along. So in one of these quote bankruptcies, there was a parcel of land in New York that is where the bookstore that had been there for a very long time sat. So he came to New York, and he used to come to New York a lot. And J. Edgar Hoover would always have him followed, but he couldn't do anything because he too was protected. Okay, he was protected because he was a Zionist. He was, and Hoover knew that Robert Maxwell would travel at least 6 times a year to the Eastern Bloc, right? To Russia, to these places, and he was suspicious of him, and he thought he was a spy. Well, he was right, but even his hands were tied because he was blackmailed. Blackmail has been used for a very long time. So Robert Maxwell was never arrested. However, in 1953, he came to the property that he owned. He's the landlord, but he doesn't just want the property, and he doesn't just want the rent from like one of the more prominent families in New York City at the time. He tells the guy, I'm not going to renew your lease. I want you out of here. And I'm going to, and he gave him a couple of dollars for the bookstore. So fact is that Robert Maxwell had a business presence in New York City commencing in 1953. Ghislaine Maxwell is not born, I believe, until 1960 or 1961. And so Whitney Webb has that wrong. And I just wanted to clarify that for you. The other thing that she has wrong, and again, I only listened to 10 minutes because I was annoyed. As somebody who was part of this world and who lived through such horrors, having somebody kidnap me and being afraid for my life literally on a daily basis, and with the recent I'm sorry, it's just like sometimes it just sounds like it should be a movie, but it's not. It's my life. With the recent arrival of the new owner of Twitter, who on the day that he decided to reinstate Donald Trump completely made my Twitter account disappear. And, I had a lot of my research material there. It was considered the best open source place if you were studying anything about Jeffrey Epstein or Ghislaine Maxwell or any of the other trafficking rings that came before. And then I had more information about other connected crimes. For 3.5 years, I worked tirelessly, as all of you know, on keeping everyone informed about all of this stuff. So one of the things that she misunderstood about the Kennedy family and Robert Maxwell's interest in the Kennedy family, Whitney Webb appears to believe, perhaps this is an innocent mistake. I don't know, because I don't think she's legit. Sorry, she's been attacking me through her baby's father, Johnny Vedmore, who I never even knew until I discovered that he has a bunch of sock puppet accounts, and he's been trying to, quote, take me down and saying things about me that are meant to discredit me. Really? So if they have to do that, well, I must pose a problem for them. And what's the problem? That I'm an actual victim of this cabal, and that I actually lived through a lot of the stuff that Whitney Webb would have no knowledge of. She references mainstream media sources. I reference true life memory, and I reference stuff that I know to be true because of my connection and what I had to live through. So she's being propped up by the other side, and I hope many of you open your eyes. So let me just get back to another tidbit, which is not even a small tidbit. It's a big part of the story. Robert Maxwell wasn't interested in marrying Ghislaine Maxwell off to the Kennedys. No. It's so frustrating because usually the very first story that you hear, that any person hears about a crime, is what we tend to remember the most, which is why most of us remember American history, if you will, the way we learned it in school. It was not the truth. Now, many years later, we're aware of the fact that it was not the truth. And so that some people who have heard the Epstein Maxwell story only from Whitney Webb, or who heard it first from Whitney Webb, will tend to believe her. That's called imprinting. So there are other people out there that are imprinters. And I'm not going to name them, but I think some of you know who I mean, because people that are have been imprinting, let's say, misinformation about the Franklin abuse case, not including the fact that it was connected also to MK Ultra and mind control. Now, that's a big omission if you're going to talk about the Franklin child abuse case, or you're going to write books about that. You better include the MK Ultra aspect, because if you don't, then I'm me, because I know somebody who was one of the handlers, if you will. He's connected also to my abuser, a congressman who was a handler for Paul Bonacci. I'm sorry. I began this podcast not feeling frustrated, but I do get frustrated. Okay, get back to Robert Maxwell was not interested in marrying Ghislaine off to the Kennedys. She was involved with a count of very dubious background, which I include in Ghislaine Maxwell. I include a whole chapter on her years between 1986 through 1990, when she was involved with this count. Again, very dubious stuff with murders and all kinds of really strange things. But Robert Maxwell was not interested in marrying her off to the Kennedys. The reason that he was interested in the Kennedys was to spy on them, because they were a powerful family. They did not become the powerful family, let's say, like the Rockefellers, but he would give her assignments. And so two of those assignments were, and in my book, Ghislaine Maxwell, an unauthorized biography, I explain that Robert Maxwell trained his daughter how to be a spy. Now, I focused on Ghislaine because that's what the book was about, but he trained his other children also on how to spy. In Ghislaine's case, she was gregarious. She was a better looking than the other sisters, although in my opinion, the very first daughter, who doesn't really want to have anything to do during the time of Robert Maxwell's, the time that he was active, she didn't really want to have anything to do with him. I think she was the real beauty of the family. But people have sort of recreated Ghislaine's role in saying that I don't think Ghislaine is even, she's not a beauty, but she does have a lot of chutzpah, meaning she's got a lot of bravado, and she was taught how to listen and how to gather important people, because she was around them her whole life, and her father made it a point to introduce her, let's say, for example, to Ronald Reagan, to introduce her to Ariel Sharon, to introduce her to the heads of all the states. So he instructed Ghislaine Maxwell to go to certain places because he wanted her to spy. And so two of those places that he instructed her to go to was the wedding of two of the original Kennedy seniors, his grandchildren, sons of Joe Kennedy, I believe. Robert Kennedy, sorry. And so she went, and so, yeah, she mingled with them, but that was to get information. Now, the Kennedy connection that Robert Maxwell has is where the interesting thing really exists, and that is Samuel Pissar. I'm going to repeat that name. Samuel Pissar was Robert Maxwell's attorney and long-term friend. Samuel Pissar is also a Zionist. Samuel Pissar, on behalf of Israel, became the, quote, advisor to John F. Kennedy during his presidency. This is when Ghislaine Maxwell is a toddler. Okay, so Robert Maxwell's interest in the Kennedys is because they're connected to different factions of this, I'm going to call it the overworld, although it's really the underworld, right? Because it's full of criminals, but they're the overworld. And so he wanted to continue the information flow. Now, Samuel Pissar happens to be the stepfather of Antony Blinken. The name might be familiar to you because Antony Blinken is the stepson of Samuel Pissar. Samuel Pissar, by the way, is the very last person with whom Robert Maxwell had a conversation with on the night that he died. So back in November 1991, from his yacht, the Lady Ghislaine, he called his confidant and advisor, and he had a conversation with him. And so, and not only is he the last person that he speaks to, but when Betty was so distraught hearing that her husband, and I believe Betty truly loved her husband. He was handsome when they met. He was not fat. He was nicer to her when they met. So that when she learned about his death, who helped her? Samuel Pissar. he became the family's connection to Israel. Samuel Pizarro, who had been Kennedy's trusted advisor from Israel, living in France, who later has a similar relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. At some point, I will get to that. Consoles Betty, and it is the person who was responsible for putting together the funeral that was, a tribute for a prime minister in Jerusalem for Robert Maxwell. That was Samuel Pizarro. He handled all of the arrangements, and they finally buried Robert Maxwell on November 11th, 1991. Now, Samuel Pizarro, aside from having a stepson, Anthony Blinken, who in fact was in the White House at the same time that Glenn's two nephews, by the way, were in the White House during the Obama administration. Samuel Pizarro's stepson, Anthony Blinken, was in, quote, the Situation Room. I have a photo of that I'll try to find and put up for you somewhere. It's just, it's when they caught and captured and killed the guy that they said was responsible for the 9/11 attacks, who they threw overboard and buried him that way, although no pictures were shown. Sure. See, I don't trust Biden. I don't trust Obama. I don't trust Clinton. I don't trust Trump. I don't trust the Bushes. I don't trust many of these people, because by the time you get to that position, you're already part of sort of like you have a role, and it's not you making the decisions. You're making the decisions that you were told to make, right? So he also has a daughter by the name of Leah Pizarro, and she also worked in Bill Clinton's White House. And she had a very, very top position in his White House. So she worked at the State Department. She worked as the communications director at the National Security Council. And anything online for Leah Pizarro, scrubbed. Any connection to her and Bill Clinton's White House, scrubbed. What I was able to find, I think 3 years ago when I was working on one of my books, was that she was connected to a Rothschild foundation named the Aladdin Project. And the Aladdin Project, their website said something about the goal of the program is to counter racism and intolerance of Jews. The Zionists tend to focus their energy on two different fronts in order to take over the world. I don't know how else to say it. And they've been doing this for a very long time. The first one is to use the argument that if you say something about Zionism, which is it's not a religion, not every Jewish person is a Zionist. Zionism is a political action. It's a political front. But for them to then counter with all of their sock puppet accounts online, oh, well, you must be an anti-Semite, which is not true, right? So they do that. That's their number one argument. The second thing that they're involved with, if you If you're here listening to me by now, you should know that they're all involved in children's charities. They're involved with the most vulnerable. And so we have to go back to Epstein's words, the younger the better. So the younger a child is, then that youngster will connect to whatever the nefarious people are training them to do. And they're ripe and easy pickings. So the other and by now a lot of you know about the connection of Ghislaine Maxwell's nephews, as well as Xavier Molina, who also worked for Barack Obama and Joe Biden's 2008 presidential campaign. And he too, you know, sort of went and scrubbed all of that stuff from his online information. However, he also worked for Akamai. That's an interesting one. He worked for Akamai. He worked for the Carnegie Endowment. He worked for his profile that he had on LinkedIn states he was a data scientist. Interesting phrase, right? A data scientist, ex-Googler, Obama White House alum, former lecturer, and he lives in Paris, France. He was an intern at the Clinton Global Initiative and the Clinton Foundation as a global solver. So he was part of the whole Clinton crowd. But to get back to the Kennedy situation, again, Robert Maxwell didn't want Ghislaine Maxwell to marry a Kennedy. He simply wanted her to spy on them and go back and report it to her father, who would then use the information in nefarious ways. The you know, I've been working, what happens every now and then is I'll start working on a newsletter, and then I realize, oh, well, gee, I can't put all the information that I need to put in this one newsletter, and it becomes a series. And so it began as a 4-part series where I talked about a sort of a B actress who I won't name right now, became a multiple part series, and then I decided to call it Epstein's Women. I think some of you are aware of it. I'm releasing part 8 on Tuesday, and I'm including the first time that Jeffrey Epstein was arrested, which nobody knows about. It was not in Palm Beach in 2005 when he was exposed as having inappropriate relationships with minors. It was not certainly in 2019 when he was arrested on July the 6th, when he landed from Paris in Newark, but it happened actually many decades ago. And just as he skated from the Towers financial Ponzi scheme, he skated after his first arrest, which nobody has written about. So that information will be in Tuesday's newsletter. I'm also going to be going deep into who Eva Anderson really is, because none of these people are who they pretend to be. We know from Virginia Giuffre that she tweeted that Eva and her husband, Glenn, were her, quote, tester couple. that after Glenn and Epstein trained her, she was sent on an airplane to their hotel, where she then gave Eva just a rub because she was pregnant at the time, but that then she said that in the next room, so they had a suite, that something happened between herself and Glenn. And in some of her tweets, she said that they were, quote, part of the trafficking ring. In this part 8 of Epstein's Women, I go not only into Eva, but I go into the whole Swedish connection. So just like there's a French connection, there's a Swedish connection. And none of the media in the United States has talked about this. None of the media in the UK has talked about this, although I will say that the UK has been at least publishing stories, even though they're very tame stories, about the Epstein Maxwell situation. And I'll tell you why. It's because there is a war, an internal war going on between the United States, which the British were supposed to be, well, the United States was a British colony, or so they thought. There's a lot of the history of the United States where that we're still dealing with trying to separate. There are some people who like the idea of the monarchy and being connected to the United Kingdom, but as we can see, the one person who was, I'm going to call it, sacrificed was Prince Andrew. Now, he deserved it because I believe that he did what Virginia Giuffre alleges that he did. He did go ahead and settle the civil lawsuit, but the reason that no other person, let's say like Clinton or Trump or any of the other many men who were named, will not see justice, is not only because, let's say, someone like David Boies and John Stanley Pottinger are standing guard, but because there is this war going on that between the UK and the United States. And frankly, at some point probably in part 9 or part 10 of this series, Epstein's Women. And if you can do it by becoming a member of the Epstein Project newsletter, which you can find on my website, kirbysommers.com, and go to subscribe. Or you can just buy the book, which I will be releasing, I think only through my website at this point, because I don't trust any other platform based on the fact that I am currently being, there's a lot of pushback against me. Well, gee, I wonder why. So I will be explaining how Princess Diana reappears in this sort of thing with the Mossad in the middle and the CIA, and that shows up into, I think it'll be in part 9, maybe part 10. But what I'm writing about, no one else has written about, and I write very detailed information. So, and I write correct information. I don't say that, for example, not to belabor the point, but I don't say that Robert Maxwell wanted Ghislaine Maxwell to marry a Kennedy when that wasn't the case. He wanted her to spy on the Kennedys. I don't say that Robert Maxwell just established a connection in New York a few years before he dies. I basically go into the whole history and tell you he established it in 1953. There's a lot of stuff that no one is covering, and that I have some recollection of having information like this, that I share with you, and I share it with you on my Substack. Oh, by the way, I just listened to Professor Hamamoto's podcast that he did on Thanksgiving, where he goes into the conversation of the interview that Glenn Beck just did with Whitney Webb. Now, the very next day, Glenn Beck is interviewing the Prime Minister of Israel, which he has done this many times. It's not just the first time that he's interviewed the Prime Minister of Israel. But he goes into this and he describes what a synthetic person is and how you can tell a synthetic person. And yeah, I've been on his show a couple of times, and I'm sure going to be on his show again. But I encourage you, if you're not listening to Professor Hamamoto, just plug him into the YouTube search bar and go take a listen to his show and subscribe to his podcast, because he's wise to who's a synthetic person, meaning who's being propped up by the elite as a voice that's going to feed you a little bit of real information, but not give you either the whole story or distort it, but keep you perpetually locked in a place where you never really get the answer. Me, I need answers, and so I share my answers with you. All right, so I don't know how long I've been doing this. It's probably a long podcast. I apologize that it's too long, but if you haven't liked the video, like the video. So just to get back really quickly to something that Professor Hamamoto said. So he has subscribed, as many people, to my second newsletter on Substack, but I think he thinks that it's sort of like a replacement for Twitter. It's not. It's a place for people who write, and I decided to have a second newsletter based on the success of my first newsletter. And I have to tell you that it has been so warmly received. So many people are joining, not just free, but they're paying, which is great, because I'm not rich like Whitney Webb. I don't have $8 to $10 million of my own. I don't have a rich father. I'm not plugged into the elite strata where, I have access to money. I depend on you, my followers, the people who support my work, the people who become subscribers to my newsletters. You pay my bills, and I appreciate that, because that keeps me in a position where I can spend the time to dig up information that is not shared anywhere and share it with you. Granted, I do it only through my newsletters because I don't want to be censored. And so I don't share everything, let's say on YouTube, which is free. All right, so I have YouTube, which is free. If you've been smart enough to find me on Twitter, you can find me on Twitter, and that's free. And occasionally, like yesterday, I put out a free newsletter on Substack. So Substack, contrary to what Professor Hamamoto said, it's not a substitute for Twitter, because clearly I write very long articles there. But the advantage of Substack, for example, as compared to my Epstein Project newsletter, is that it does allow you to interact with me. So we can connect, you can make a comment, I'll respond to it. I'm going to say this as I try to wrap this up for today. Sometimes it takes a lot of time, by the way, to answer everybody's question, or to, interact, and sometimes to interact more than once with one person. It's time consuming, and I'm just one person. I don't have a staff, and I don't have $10 million like Whitney Webb. I'm sorry to keep harping on her, but she has done so much harm to me. that I'm glad that she's finally being exposed, because why are you picking on, I'm a survivor of not only being trafficked, sexually trafficked, but of being a sex slave of the very elite ring that she's trying to expose. How can you expose it? I'm sorry, but how can Whitney Webb expose a ring where she doesn't talk about Meshulam Riklis, or she doesn't talk about the Cornfells, or she doesn't talk about Aristotle Onassis? I'm sorry, but if you don't talk about the Ricklises, who are a key part of this, you're not doing the necessary research, or and hence you want me gone. I'm not going anywhere, Whitney, or Johnny Vedmore, or whoever the hell you people are, or whoever the hell you're working for. I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to be right here explaining to people what's really going on and what I lived through and what I saw and what I can attest to. But in any event, on my Substack, you can communicate with me. Now, I was going to say that sometimes I communicate back even on YouTube, and I will tell someone, I will give somebody an answer, and that person will have a rebuttal. I'm not here to argue with you guys or with anyone, so please don't do that. If I give you an answer, like one person wanted to know, well, I don't want to use PayPal on your website. I said, I use it as a, they're just my, sort of my merchant. You can bypass, you don't need a PayPal account. You can bypass it. They take any credit card. You don't have to have a PayPal account. For me, it's worked. I've had it since 2012 because I wrote ebooks for my real estate business. So I've had it since 2012. It works for me. And after I explained to this person, who I know meant well, probably in all likelihood meant well, she came back and said, well, why don't you do this? I'm not looking to argue with you. I need to do things in a certain way because my life is at stake. Your life is not at stake. Your intellectual material is not at stake, although thank you for your advice. But don't have me go do back and forth 2 or 3 or 4 conversations, because I don't have the time for that, and I don't have the patience, because I have like 1,000 inquiries every single day, and I don't need the stress of having to explain myself more than one time. And most of you are darlings, and I know that you mean well, but if I answer once, please just accept my answer, because I have to do things differently, again, because I am concerned for my safety, not just my online safety, but my physical safety. For me, it's a matter of life or death. In any event, I plan to have a good day. I will calm down after this, and I hope that you guys have a really nice day. If you have not liked the video, please like it, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.